The morning sun cast long shadows across London as Catherine Windsor pressed her face against the cool window of her apartment in Kensington Palace. Below, she could see the streets slowly filling with people carrying flowers, flags, and photographs. Today was different from any other day she had experienced in her 28 years of life. Her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had passed away peacefully in her sleep just 1 week ago at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The news had shattered the family and sent shockwaves around the world. Now, the entire royal family was preparing to gather at St. Paul's Cathedral for a special memorial service that would bring together not just immediate family members, but also distant relatives who hadn't spoken in years. Catherine's phone buzzed constantly with messages from cousins, aunts, and uncles she barely knew. Some lived in different countries. Others had been involved in family disputes that seemed to stretch back decades. But today, all of that would be set aside. The Queen had always been the glue that held everyone together. And even in death, she was bringing them back to one another. Her brother James knocked softly on her door before entering. At 31, he had always been the responsible one, the heir who took his duties seriously. His usually neat appearance looked slightly disheveled, and Catherine could see the stress of the past week written across his face. "Are you ready for this?" James asked, adjusting his black tie for what seemed like the 100th time that morning. Catherine nodded, though she wasn't sure she truly was ready. The past week had been a blur of funeral arrangements, media interviews, and family meetings. She had barely had time to process her own grief, let alone prepare for facing relatives she hadn't seen since childhood. Their father, King Charles, had been surprisingly emotional during the planning meetings. Catherine remembered how he had broken down when discussing the music choices for the service. The Queen had loved hymns, particularly How Great Thou Art, and Charles insisted it be included even though it wasn't traditionally sung at royal memorial services. The family's publicist, Margaret Thompson, had been working around the clock to coordinate with relatives flying in from around the globe. Cousin Victoria was coming from Australia, where she had been living for 15 years after a falling out with her mother over money. Uncle Richard was traveling from Canada, bringing his 3 children who had never met most of their British cousins. Even Great Aunt Penelope, who was 93 and hadn't left her home in years, had insisted on making the journey from her countryside estate. Catherine walked to her closet and pulled out the black dress she had chosen for the service. It was simple but elegant, something her grandmother would have approved of. The Queen had always emphasized that royal fashion should be appropriate and respectful, never flashy or attention-seeking. As she got dressed, Catherine thought about the conversations she had overheard between her parents over the past few days. There were concerns about family members who might cause drama or say inappropriate things to the media. Cousin David had been known to drink too much at family gatherings, and Aunt Sarah had a habit of sharing family secrets with journalists. But there were also stories of family members putting aside their differences. Uncle Michael, who hadn't spoken to his brother Robert in 5 years over a business dispute, had called to ask if they could sit together during the service. Cousin Emma, who had been estranged from the family after her divorce, had written a beautiful letter expressing her desire to honor the Queen's memory alongside everyone else. Catherine's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her cousin William, calling from his hotel room near the cathedral. His voice was tired but determined. "I've been thinking about what grandmother would want from today," William said. "She always believed that family was the most important thing, even when we disagreed or fought with each other." Catherine smiled for the first time in days. William had always been wise beyond his years, and she knew he was right. The Queen had spent her entire life putting family first, often sacrificing her own wants and needs to keep everyone together. "She would want us to remember why we're family," Catherine replied. "Not because we have to be, but because we choose to be." As the morning progressed, Catherine could feel the weight of the day ahead. St. Paul's Cathedral would soon fill with hundreds of family members, friends, and dignitaries. But more importantly, it would be filled with love, memories, and the shared understanding that they were all connected by something deeper than titles or traditions. The Queen was gone, but Her legacy of bringing people together would live on through this day, and hopefully through many days to come. The grand entrance of St. Paul's Cathedral buzzed with quiet activity as family members began arriving throughout the morning. Security personnel moved discreetly among the gathering crowd, while photographers captured the historic moments from respectful distances. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was both solemn and filled with an unexpected warmth as relatives who hadn't seen each other in years embraced and shared quiet words. Cousin Victoria arrived from Australia looking tanned and nervous. She clutched a small bouquet of eucalyptus leaves, a tribute from her adopted homeland. Her mother, Aunt Patricia, had died 2 years earlier without the two ever reconciling their differences. Victoria had always regretted missing the chance to make peace, and she was determined not to let old family wounds prevent her from honoring her grandmother's memory. Near the altar, Uncle Richard stood with his 3 teenage children, pointing out family members they had only seen in newspaper photographs. His daughter Sarah, now 16, was amazed to discover she had so many cousins her own age. His twin boys, Michael and Robert, were surprisingly well-behaved despite being notorious troublemakers back home in Toronto. Great Aunt Penelope made quite an entrance, arriving in an antique Rolls-Royce that had belonged to the Queen Mother. At 93, she moved slowly but with dignity, refusing help from anyone except her longtime companion, Mrs. Henderson. Penelope had been the Queen's closest confidant for over 70 years, and her presence brought a sense of living history to the gathering. King Charles moved through the cathedral, greeting each family member personally. His grief was evident, but so was his determination to fulfill what he knew would have been his mother's greatest wish, seeing the family united. When he reached Cousin David, there was a moment of tension. David had been drinking, though not heavily, and Charles could smell alcohol on his breath. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," David stammered, using the formal address even though they were family. "I know I've been a disappointment." Charles surprised everyone nearby by embracing his cousin warmly. "Today isn't about disappointments, David. It's about family. Grandmother loved you just as you are." The conversation between them continued for several minutes, with David sharing stories about how the Queen had secretly sent him money during his difficult divorce 3 years earlier. She had never mentioned it to anyone else in the family, but her quiet generosity had helped him keep his small farm in Wales. Meanwhile, Catherine found herself in an unexpected conversation with Cousin Emma, the family member who had been essentially banished after her messy divorce from a prominent businessman. Emma had arrived wearing a simple black dress and carrying a handwritten letter addressed to the entire family. "I know many people here probably wish I hadn't come," Emma said quietly. "But she was my grandmother too, and she never stopped sending me birthday cards, even when others stopped speaking to me." Catherine learned that the Queen had maintained correspondence with Emma throughout her exile from the family. The letters were filled with news about cousins getting married, babies being born, and family achievements. The Queen had never judged Emma for her choices, instead offering love and support during her darkest moments. The cathedral slowly filled with more family members, each carrying their own stories of how the Queen had touched their lives. Cousin George shared how she had personally attended his graduation from university, even though it was a small ceremony that received no media attention. Aunt Margaret told anyone who would listen about how the Queen had visited her in the hospital after a cancer diagnosis, spending hours just talking and offering comfort. As the morning progressed, something beautiful began to happen. Family members who had been feuding for years found themselves sharing memories and rediscovering connections. Uncle Michael and his brother Robert sat together for the first time in 5 years, looking through old photographs on Michael's phone. Their argument over business seemed petty and unimportant compared to the loss they were all feeling. The younger generation was particularly affected by the gathering. Cousins who had grown up hearing whispered stories about family drama were now meeting the people behind those stories and finding them to be nothing like they had imagined. Victoria's daughter, Alice, hit it off immediately with Catherine's younger sister, and They discovered they both loved painting and had both been secretly writing letters to the Queen about their dreams of becoming artists. Archbishop Williams arrived to conduct the memorial service, but he spent time walking among the family members before the formal ceremony began. He had known the Queen personally for over 20 years and had performed several royal weddings and baptisms. His presence brought comfort to many, especially the older family members who remembered him from happier occasions. The cathedral's choir began warming up, their voices echoing through the historic space. The sounds seemed to quiet the conversations and draw everyone's attention to why they were really there. This wasn't just a family reunion. It was a celebration of a remarkable woman who had dedicated her entire life to bringing people together. As the formal service approached, family members began taking their seats. The seating arrangements had been carefully planned to encourage reconciliation while respecting family hierarchies. Estranged relatives found themselves sitting near each other, creating opportunities for conversation and healing. Catherine looked around at the filled cathedral and felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Despite all the family drama and years of silence between various relatives, everyone had come together. The Queen's influence was still working its magic, bringing love and unity to a family that had sometimes forgotten how much they meant to each other. The memorial service began with the deep, resonant tones of the cathedral's organ filling every corner of the ancient building. As the first hymn started, something extraordinary happened. Voices that hadn't sung together in years joined in perfect harmony. The Queen had always insisted that music brought families together, and even in death, she was proving herself right. King Charles stood at the lectern to deliver the first reading, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. He spoke about his mother's unwavering dedication to family, sharing a story that few people knew. When Catherine was born, the Queen had personally knitted her first blanket, working on it late into the night between official duties. She had done the same for every grandchild and great-grandchild, no matter how busy her schedule became. She taught us that love isn't just a feeling, Charles said, his voice carrying to every person in the cathedral. Love is action. Love is showing up. Love is making time for what matters most, even when the world demands your attention elsewhere. As Charles returned to his seat, Cousin Victoria surprised everyone by standing up. She hadn't been scheduled to speak, but something inside her had been building throughout the morning. The Archbishop nodded his permission, and Victoria walked slowly to the front of the cathedral. "I need to say something," Victoria began, her Australian accent clear in the quiet space. "I lived 15,000 miles away for 15 years, and I thought that meant I was no longer part of this family. I thought I had lost my connection to all of you." Victoria's voice cracked slightly as she continued. "But Grandmother never let me go. She sent letters every month, filled with news about everyone here. She remembered my birthday, my children's birthdays, even my husband's birthday. When my son was sick last year, she somehow found out and sent him a care package filled with British sweets and a personal note telling him to get well soon." The cathedral was completely silent except for Victoria's words. I realized now that I wasn't forgotten or cast aside. I was always part of this family, even when I forgot it myself. And looking around today, I see that none of us were ever truly alone. She kept us all connected, even when we didn't know it. Victoria's impromptu speech sparked something unexpected. One by one, other family members began standing and sharing their own stories. Uncle Richard talked about how the Queen had secretly funded his children's education when his business failed 5 years earlier. Cousin David shared how she had personally intervened when he was struggling with alcohol, connecting him with treatment resources, and visiting him during his recovery. Great Aunt Penelope, despite her age, insisted on speaking. With Mrs. Henderson's help, she made her way to the front of the cathedral. Her voice was thin but clear as she shared memories going back 70 years. "Elizabeth wasn't just our queen," Penelope said. "She was the heart of our family. When my husband died in 1987, she came to my house every Sunday for 6 months just to have tea and make sure I wasn't alone. She never missed a Sunday, even when she had important state functions to attend. The stories continued, each one revealing new layers of the Queen's quiet generosity and love. Cousin Emma read portions of a letter she had received during her exile, letters filled with encouragement and reminders that family love doesn't disappear just because of mistakes or misunderstandings. Young Alice, Victoria's daughter, surprised everyone by asking if she could share something. At only 14, she was the youngest person to speak, but her words carried unexpected wisdom. "I never met my great-grandmother in person," Alice said, her voice stronger than her age might suggest. "But I feel like I knew her through all the stories Mom told me, and through all the letters she sent us. She taught me that family isn't just about living in the same place or seeing each other all the time. Family is about keeping love alive across any distance." As the formal service continued, the atmosphere in the cathedral had completely transformed. What had begun as a solemn memorial had become something more, a celebration not just of the Queen's life, but of the family bond she had spent decades nurturing and protecting. The choir performed "How Great Thou Art," the Queen's favorite hymn, and this time every voice in the cathedral joined in. Cousins who hadn't spoken in years stood side by side, sharing hymnals and harmonizing naturally. The music seemed to wash away years of petty disagreements and hurt feelings. Archbishop Williams delivered a homily that focused on the Queen's greatest achievement, not her reign as monarch, but her success as a family matriarch. He spoke about how she had managed to maintain connections across generations, continents, and conflicts. She understood that families are like gardens, the Archbishop said. They require constant tending, regular care, and infinite patience. Sometimes plants grow in different directions. Sometimes they need space to flourish, but with proper care, they always remain part of the same garden. As the service continued, family members began reaching out to each other in small gestures. Uncle Michael placed his hand on his brother Robert's shoulder during a prayer. Cousin David was invited to sit with Catherine's family, where he was welcomed without judgment or criticism. The cathedral began to feel less like a formal church service and more like an intimate family gathering. The Queen's presence seemed to fill the space, not in a supernatural way, but in the love and connection that was flowing between all the people she had cared for throughout her life. When it came time for the final hymn, King Charles made an unexpected announcement. Instead of the planned closing song, he wanted everyone to sing "Happy Birthday," because today would have been the Queen's 87th birthday, and she had always loved celebrating birthdays more than any other occasion. The entire cathedral erupted in the familiar tune, sung with more joy and love than any happy birthday in history. Through tears and laughter, the royal family sang for their grandmother, their matriarch, and their greatest example of unconditional love. After the formal service ended, nobody wanted to leave. The cathedral, which had witnessed countless royal ceremonies over the centuries, had never felt quite like this. Family members lingered in the pews, continuing conversations that had started during the service and beginning new ones that felt long overdue. Catherine found herself surrounded by cousins she barely remembered from childhood. Emma's son, Thomas, was close to her age and had become a successful photographer. He had been documenting the day quietly, capturing candid moments of family members reconnecting. When he showed Catherine some of his photos, she was amazed by what she saw. Genuine smiles, warm embraces, and faces full of love rather than the formal expressions usually seen at royal events. Great Aunt Penelope had become the center of attention near the altar, with younger family members gathering around to hear her stories about the Queen's early years. Penelope's memory was sharp despite her age, and she painted vivid pictures of Elizabeth as a young mother, struggling to balance royal duties with raising children. She used to sneak into the nursery at midnight, Penelope told the captivated audience. She would sit in the rocking chair and just watch Charles and sleep, sometimes for hours. She said those quiet moments were when she felt most like herself, not like a queen or a public figure, just like a mother who loved her children. Uncle Richard's children were fascinated by these glimpses into royal family life. They had grown up thinking of their British relatives as formal, distant figures, but the stories revealed ordinary people dealing with extraordinary circumstances. Cousin David had found a quiet corner with Catherine's father, King Charles, where they were having the first real conversation they'd shared in years. David was explaining how the Queen's support during his darkest period had literally saved his life. He had been on the verge of losing everything, his farm, his family, even his will to live, when the Queen's letters started arriving. She never preached or gave advice, David explained. She just told me stories about other family members who had faced difficult times and found their way through. She made me realize I wasn't alone and that my struggles didn't define me. Charles listened with growing amazement as David described a side of his mother he had never fully understood. While Charles had been dealing with the public duties and official responsibilities of being heir to the throne, the Queen had been quietly maintaining personal relationships with dozens of family members, each requiring different types of support and attention. Meanwhile, Victoria was having an emotional reunion with her Aunt Sarah, Patricia's sister. They hadn't spoken since Patricia's funeral, when grief and old resentments had caused a terrible argument. Now, surrounded by the love and acceptance they were feeling from the entire family, their own disagreements seemed silly and unnecessary. "Patricia would have wanted us to be here together," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "She would have wanted the family united, just like this." Victoria nodded, remembering how her mother had always spoken fondly of royal family gatherings from when she was young. Patricia's later bitterness had been caused by feeling excluded and forgotten, but Victoria now realized that the exclusion had been largely self-imposed. The Queen had continued reaching out, but Patricia had been too proud to accept help or maintain connections. As the afternoon progressed, spontaneous groups formed throughout the cathedral. Wedding plans were discussed, as Cousin George's engagement had been overshadowed by the Queen's death. Business partnerships were explored, as various family members discovered they had complementary skills and interests. Most importantly, simple friendships began forming between people who had shared genetic material, but little else for far too long. Young Alice and Catherine's sister and had become inseparable, making plans for Alice to visit London during her school holidays. They discovered they both shared the Queen's love of painting and had been secretly working on portraits of her from photographs. They decided to combine their efforts and create a collaborative artwork that would honor their great-grandmother's memory. The teenage boys, Michael and Robert from Canada, had initially been bored by what they expected to be a stuffy formal event. But they found themselves genuinely interested in hearing stories about their family history and learning about their British heritage. Catherine's brother James took them around the cathedral, explaining the historical significance of various features and sharing stories about royal ceremonies they had attended. Archbishop Williams had originally planned to leave after the service, but he found himself drawn into the family conversations. He shared memories of private moments with the Queen, including her surprising sense of humor and her genuine concern for everyone she met. He told them about how she had personally written thank you notes to every church volunteer after royal weddings, and how she always remembered to ask about people's families during subsequent meetings. As evening approached, someone suggested moving to a nearby restaurant for dinner together. The idea spread quickly through the group, and soon arrangements were being made for the largest family dinner the royal family had shared in decades. Security details scrambled to accommodate the spontaneous plan, while restaurant managers worked frantically to create space for the unexpected royal gathering. The procession from St. Paul's Cathedral to the restaurant became an impromptu parade of family unity. Walking side by side, the family members created a sight that amazed the crowds of onlookers who had gathered throughout the day. Instead of the formal, reserved expressions typically seen at royal events, faces were animated with conversation and genuine joy. Photographers captured images that would become iconic. Uncle Michael and Brother Robert walking arm in arm, Victoria holding hands with her Aunt Sarah, Great Aunt Penelope laughing heartily at something King Charles had whispered in her ear. These weren't staged photos or carefully orchestrated moments. They were authentic expressions of a family that had rediscovered its connections. The day had transformed from a memorial service into something the Queen would have loved even more. A celebration of family love that transcended all the differences, distances, and disagreements that had separated them for too long. The restaurant dinner became legendary in the family's history, a night that would be talked about for generations to come. What started as a simple meal together turned into an 8-hour celebration filled with laughter, tears, stories, and the kind of deep connections that the Queen had spent her entire life hoping to foster among her loved ones. Tables were pushed together to accommodate the large group, creating one long table that seemed to stretch across half the restaurant. The formal seating arrangements from the cathedral were forgotten as family members chose to sit with people they wanted to get to know better or reconnect with after years apart. Cousin Victoria found herself seated between Great Aunt Penelope and young Thomas, Emma's son. The three generations shared stories that bridged decades of family history. Penelope told them about the Queen's wedding day, sharing details that had never been published in any biography. Victoria described her children's reactions to learning they were part of the British royal family, while Thomas showed them photographs he had taken during his travels around Europe, many of which featured places the Queen had visited during state tours. The conversation naturally turned to the future and what the family wanted to do to honor the Queen's memory. Uncle Richard suggested creating a scholarship fund in her name, focused on helping families stay connected across distances. His idea sparked enthusiasm from around the table, with various family members offering different types of support. She would have loved that, King Charles said, his voice warm with approval. She always believed that families were stronger when they invested in each other's success. Cousin David, who had been quiet for much of the dinner, suddenly spoke up with surprising emotion. "I want to contribute to that scholarship," he said. "I want to sell my farm in Wales and use the money to help other families who are struggling to stay together." The table fell silent for a moment, not from disapproval, but from respect for David's generous impulse. Uncle Michael reached across the table to shake David's hand, and soon the gesture was repeated around the entire table as family members clasped hands in a spontaneous show of unity. Emma read aloud from the letter she had brought to the cathedral, sharing the Queen's words from their final correspondence just months before her death. The letter revealed the Queen's hope that the family would use her passing as an opportunity to heal old wounds and build stronger connections for the future. "Remember that love grows stronger when it's shared," Emma read from the letter. "Every kindness you show to each other honors the bonds that connect us all. Don't let pride or past hurts prevent you from experiencing the joy of being truly known and loved by your family." As the evening continued, plans began forming for future gatherings. Cousin George's wedding, originally planned as a small affair, was reimagined as a major family reunion. Victoria invited everyone to visit Australia, offering to host a family Christmas gathering on the beach. Uncle Richard suggested an annual family reunion that would rotate between different countries where family members lived. The younger generation was particularly excited about staying connected. Alice and exchanged contact information and made plans to start a family newsletter that would keep everyone updated on important news and achievements. Thomas offered to create a family website where members could share photos and stories. The teenage boys from Canada asked if they could spend part of their summer vacation in London, learning more about their British heritage. As midnight approached, nobody wanted the evening to end. The restaurant staff had long since finished their regular service, but they graciously allowed the family to continue their gathering. The manager later said it was the most joyful event his establishment had ever hosted, with laughter and love filling every corner of the space. Great Aunt Penelope, despite her age, had stayed awake for the entire evening and seemed energized by the family connections she was witnessing. She announced that she was rewriting her will to ensure that her estate would support future family gatherings, creating a permanent fund for travel and accommodation expenses, so that distance would never again be a barrier to family unity. When the gathering finally began to wind down, family members exchanged contact information and made specific plans for staying in touch. Phone numbers were shared, travel dates were scheduled, and promises were made to maintain the connections that had been reestablished. The goodbye process took over an hour, with hugs, tears, and repeated promises to not let years pass before seeing each other again. Cousin Victoria's departure was particularly emotional, as she realized that returning to Australia no longer meant leaving her family behind. She now carried with her a renewed sense of belonging and dozens of new relationships that would be actively maintained. As Catherine finally returned to her apartment in Kensington Palace in the early hours of the morning, she felt exhausted but profoundly changed. The day had begun with grief and uncertainty about facing family members she barely knew. It was ending with a heart full of love and excitement about the relationships that would continue growing from this point forward. She found a handwritten note that had been slipped under her door during the day. It was from Emma, thanking her for the welcome she had received and expressing amazement at how the Queen's love had continued to work magic even after her death. "Today I learned that we never really lose the people who love us," Emma had written. "They live on in every act of kindness we show each other, in every moment we choose connection over conflict, and in every time we open our hearts to family members who might surprise us with their love." Catherine folded the note carefully and placed it in the box where she kept her most treasured correspondence from the Queen. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and challenges, but it would also bring the continued joy of being part of a family that had rediscovered its capacity for unconditional love. The Queen was gone, but her greatest legacy was alive and thriving in the hearts of every family member who had gathered to honor her memory. The royal family had united in tribute to their beloved matriarch, and in doing so, they had given themselves the gift of truly being a family once again.